Right, I think to kick off with the introductions for today's session, once again, just to introduce myself, my name is Colin Haberton. I'm the co-founder of Relative Impact, and in partnership with our UK partners, Ethical Good, we are very proud to present this report that has been put together by Data EQ, our partners that we've worked with for a number of years. What you can expect to see over the next 45 minutes is an in-depth analysis of social sentiment relating to environmental, social, and governance criteria related to the UK fashion sector. And we're looking forward to not only sharing this information, but getting your feedback as well. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our two presenters for today's session, Jamie Botha, as well as Melanie Malherbe, who are going to give you a little bit more information about Data EQ and the work that they do, and then they'll take us through the presentation. Over to you, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Colin. Hi, everyone. Great to meet you, and thank you for your time today. Thanks for joining us. So Data EQ, I just want to do a little bit of introduction to us. We're basically a data provider, and our data comes from social media. And what we do is we structure that data in a way that makes it very easy for you to digest and understand. That's the short sentence of Data EQ. The methodology of this report is what I want to take you through next. It's quite a unique way that we go about getting to the insights that we're going to show you. So I want to just start off there. Social media is an interesting place. As most of you know, it's a very noisy place. That makes it a very difficult data set to structure. So we go about it in a way where we combine AI and humans to work through the data and to structure it that way. The reason we do that, and I'm now going to pick on a bank, is because people tweet things like, post, not tweet anymore, post things like, thank you so much, Santander, for the 3 hours in your queue. I really enjoyed that. An AI tool would see the interaction of thanks and enjoy and see that as a positive view of the brand. You hearing that will understand the person's being sarcastic, and therefore the human makes it more accurate. And the second thing the human does is nowhere in that sentence are the words customer service, turnaround time, or branch mentioned. Generally AI makes use of keywords, but again, you as a human would understand that those are the three things that it's about. So that's why we bring in humans. We refer to these humans as the crowd. So if we hear the word the crowd, that is what it is. It's people that we pay to work through data for us and structure it. And they are remotely based, and we pay them based on their accuracy and speed that they go through. What they do to the data for us is they firstly decide whether the person is being positive, negative, or neutral towards the brand. They then would say, look at what the person has posted and ask whether it's posing an operational reputational risk to the brand in any way, shape, or form. They would see whether the person is making mention of being in a journey stage with the brand. They would look at whether the person is mentioning a channel of interaction. They would also look at it and go, what is this person talking about? What is the topic of conversation? And then we move into the governance space, where the first thing that they can do is look from a conduct perspective in the financial services industry specifically. Are there any mentions of a conduct view here? But then for this report specifically, what we've done is we've asked our crowd to look at the data for us in three specific ways. The first one being sentiment, as I already said. The second one being that risk factor. Does this person posting show an operational reputational risk to the brand? And then what we've done is we've actually asked them to group the conversation for us into the ESG topics. And what that looks like is something like this, where the data ends up into this topic wheel, where, as you can see, the middle of the wheel is the E, the S, and the G. And then there are further child topics that contribute to telling us what about E, S, and G is the person talking about. What that looks like is these topics that are grouped into the E, the S, and the G. I'm going to leave it there for you for a second. But in essence, that's the methodology that we've used to work through the data and to get to the insights that we're going to take you through today. I'm going to stop there and ask if there's any questions on the crowd or the way we work through the data before I move on. I'm going to take that as a no and move on. All right, so let's talk about the industry, the UK fashion industry, and what this report looks at. So firstly, we looked at about 1.8 million posts for the time period of 2020, January, to the end of December 2022. We looked at a majority of those posts came from Twitter and some online sources. There's many technical reasons for us only looking at Twitter, which I'm happy to delve in a different conversation. We did not include the whole industry and all the brands in industry here. We did a bit of a qualification process. We looked firstly at whether the brand is included in the London Stock Exchange, whether they're listed. Then we also looked at some ESG benchmarking reports from the MSCI, Sustainalytics, and FTSE Russell. And through a combination of that and with the input from the relative team, we came to 9 brands that was included in this index, being Primark, H&M, Next, ASOS, Burberry, and JD Sports. So moving on to what we saw in the industry as a whole, when we look at these 1.8 million posts, 16.7% of the conversation on social media about these brands related to ESG. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, that the majority of that conversation actually related to the social consideration side of things, followed by governance, and then by the environmental conversation. If we then look at these, I realized I missed some names in the beginning there, Superdry, Boohoo, and St. Baker. Don't know how I missed that. But as you can see, this is the share of voice per brand around ESG conversations. So this is purely volume. So as you can see, Primark holding a big share of the conversation related to ESG in the whole of the industry, followed by H&M and Next, and then ASOS with Ted Baker holding the least volume. It's always good to know that people are talking about you, but if they're talking about you negatively, that is not good. So what you're looking at here is the net sentiment per brand. Net sentiment being the number of praise coming through, and then subtracting from that the complaints coming through in conversation. So positive minus negative. So as you can see, the only brand holding a net positive sentiment in this industry is Burberry. And then as you can see at the other end of the scale there, Primark and Boohoo with the lowest net sentiment score. Now, the aim of this whole report is to delve into why is that happening and what are people talking about to get to these scores. As a starting point, you want to understand who is talking about you or about the brand. And there's kind of four main categories of people that are talking about this ESG type conversation. So on the further kind of left-hand side, you have your normal consumer. Then you have kind of journalists and press talking about the brands, followed by some activist groups, and then the likes of the organizations of PETA. And the interesting thing to note here, if you look on the far left, is that the consumer-driven conversation actually garners the most engagement. Interesting thing that came through in the report, though, is we don't know if those consumers are influencers or not. And often in this industry, influencers do drive conversation, but it just shows the consumer engage a lot more with other consumers than they would with the kind of formal organizations and activist groups, what we're trying to show here. So you can see on the right-hand side there, PETA, even though they are a very big organization, they do not get as much engagement as the likes of the consumer or influencer posts get. So we're going to start delving into the E, the S, and the G. I'm going to handle the E, and then I'm going to hand over to Jamie to take the S and the G. So let's start off with environmental. So out of all of this ESG conversation, as you can see there, 12.2% relate to people making reference to environmental considerations. And as you can see on the right-hand side, H&M holds the most share of voice around environmental in the conversation, followed by Next and Superdry. So what this looked like over the 2020 to 2022 period is something like this. So we're purely looking at volume on that gray line at the bottom. The bubbles make the standouts for what is being talked about. The red is the negative and the blue is the more positive. So as you can see, H&M received backlash there in the beginning of our line around its sustainability initiatives. This was a Scottish fashion designer that made the statement that just dyeing your top with coffee is not sustainability if your whole business does not actually speak to, your whole business model doesn't speak to sustainability. So that drove some negative conversation. There in the B number there in March 21, H&M faced allegations around greenwashing, and that was specifically around that influencer statement I just made. Just because an influencer says it's sustainable doesn't mean it actually is, and people see through that and they define it as not being true. In that lies the greenwashing accusation. And then, as you can see, Next also received some complaints over their poor quality products. Now, the last half here of the graph to me is very interesting. H&M launched their Coexist collection there by point C. It's a vegan collection. It got a lot of positivity, and it was actually backed by PETA at the time. But then the other two negative points further down the line, you can see PETA getting involved in actually saying that H&M is not following their vegan practices, and they are using mohair products, even though they were initially saying they're banning it and it does not form part of their vegan collections. And then also, as you can see there, H&M were accused of using cruel practices, and that was specifically around responsible down. And consumers perceived it to be a marketing play, and not true again. So that's kind of the themes that started popping up for environmental conversation over the year. If you look at the right-hand side of this screen, what you're looking at is per brand, the contribution or the percentages of negative versus positive per brand. And you can see the only one that stands out there is Burberry in terms of the positive space, where their positivity outranks their negativity in a huge fashion. And then you can also kind of see on the negative side, you have 5 outliers with higher than industry average negativity coming through there. That positivity and negativity is driven by what you see on the left-hand side of the screen. The majority, or not the majority, the top topics within the environmental conversation were animal rights, product longevity, sustainable initiatives, material use, and recycling and upcycling. Let's start to look at these negative and positive themes. So on the negative side, the most negative theme that stood out was animal rights. So I'm going to have a quick look at that now. So again, look to the left-hand side of the screen. These are the drivers of the negativity around animal rights specifically. So what I just said around H&M reversing their ban on cashmere and mohair products, when these products are reportedly cruelly obtained from the goats. Next, as we said, received backlash for stocking products from brands who are not cruelty-free. Then the responsible down investigation from PETA into H&M. And then also Next, again, accused of promoting clothing items made of real animal fur. Then on the right-hand side are the positive side of things. So Primark and H&M both launched a vegan clothing range, which was positively received by consumers. Boohoo partnering with the RSPCA Norwich to raise donations through the shopping with them. Next, removed a hedgehog house that was made of unsafe material from its shelves. And then a very positively experienced initiative from Burberry in banning exotic skins and accessories made from python and alligator skins came through for Burberry there, and it was very, very well received. Let's get back to the other topics that drove the negativity. So if we look at the product longevity and quality, the 2 brands that stood out there was Next and Boohoo, where consumers was simply saying that the garments are falling apart when they receive them, which then in turn increases landfill, and that's obviously a negatively perceived issue. Then if we look at the sustainability drivers, H&M and Boohoo, were actually some of their sustainability activations were received negatively purely because consumers cannot understand how they can produce at such low cost and be sustainable at the same time. So consumers were questioning that. And on the packaging side, I think across the board for all the brands, their plastic packaging in their deliveries were scrutinized and questioned. Can't all be negative. If we're looking at the positive side of things, these were the major drivers. Now, as you'll see, those numbers don't add up to 100. Generally, what happens here, you'll see the sustainability initiative or drive being the top contributor to positivity, but those overlap with the materials used, recycling, and animal rights, etc. So I'm going to delve into the material in those last 4 first again. So materials used, some brands stood out there. Superdry specifically, where they made the commitment for their pure cotton items to be purely organic cotton items by 2025. It's very well received. They also made garments from recyclable material. Then Burberry, the standout in positivity here, them producing items from waste material, and that ban on the exotic skins that I already mentioned. And on the Primark side, their vegan range was very well received. If we look at recycling, upcycling, and circularity, what stood out, the brands standing out there, H&M, they launched an in-store recycling option or organization within their stores. ASOS introduced recyclable packaging for their online deliveries. And then the Burberry again, and one of the most positively received initiatives was them donating their unused fabrics to fashion students. So if we look at them now as a whole, the sustainability initiatives and drivers, and what worked well with consumers and what worked less well, you can kind of see here that the most positively received there on the left-hand side of the screens included the campaigns around recyclable packaging, net zero emissions by 2030, the Burberry donating fabric outfits, and then the in-store recycling bins from H&M. Then the middle kind of positivity receivers is the sustainable materials used, the organic cotton, and then digitally printing textiles to reduce carbon emissions. And then the most positive sustainability initiatives around the protecting of animal rights through the launch of the vegan ranges, and then placing bans on the products and products with fur and exotic skins, etc. So use this kind of as the indicator for what consumers really latch onto and talk about in a positive fashion when designing your sustainability initiatives and activities. As I said, I'm going to hand over to Jamie in a second around the S and the G. I'm going to leave this up here for about all of 10 seconds. These are just some of the actual example mentions and posts from the brands and what those campaigns looked like. So these would be, as you can see there, on the animal rights side, the Burberry skins conversation there, and then in the recycling and upcycling and circularity, H&M with their in-store recycling system. So that's what it looked like on then Twitter, now X. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Jamie for our next sections.
Thanks so much, Mel, and welcome everyone. It's really nice to be here. So I'm going to delve into the social considerations conversation. When we looked at the contribution of social consideration to the overall ESG conversation, we can see here that the social issues were really evidently a key concern in the fashion industry. And also the factor that consumers were the most vocal about, because it contributed close to 76.9% of all ESG conversation. To the right, again, that's the brand breakdown. And you can see here that Primark definitely stood out with a volume that was nearly double to the brands that followed, which was H&M and Next. When we plotted this over time, focusing on the 3-year period, we can see that most of the major events driving this conversation were negative. Yet again, majority of this was linked to labor practices and safety concerns, actually. We can see that from the first 3 volume spikes to the left there, that COVID-19 evidently drove quite a bit of concern in this category, and various brands were called out for keeping stores and warehouses and distribution centers open during lockdown, putting their staff and workers at risk. So people were really vocal about that. Towards the end of the analysis period, looking at point E, we can start seeing a growing conversation linked to diversity and inclusivity issues that came out, which also had a strong link to the safety concerns during June. And we saw this actually continue through to December last year. We'll actually unpack that in the slides to follow. Looking at the thematic breakdown for social considerations, we can see how the events from the previous slide actually featured quite prominently in the top 3 drivers of volume when it came to topics, which was physical health and safety linked to consumers, employee treatment, and then human rights and diversity. It's interesting to note that all 3 of these top themes were actually quite negative, and they reached negativity scores of well into the 90s. So it was very negatively received. A point of interest, though, is that we saw that on the topic of human rights and diversity, this particular topic is definitely starting to grow more in recent times. And we believe that it will continue to expand as the brands become more conscious of their roles in social justice. Then looking to the right, again, the brand breakdown for sentiment comparisons, you can see there that JD Sport, Primark, and Boohoo were the brands that really stood out in terms of highest negativity. But again, the remainder of the brands did follow quite closely. The one that stood out though on a positivity side again was Burberry, which was extremely positively perceived within social consideration, and they were then followed by ASOS and Ted Baker. Looking at these positive themes or drivers of praise, we saw that social responsibility drove the bulk of the praise at 67.9%, followed by employee treatment and world events, which was closely linked to the pandemic conversation and all the brand's efforts during that time. And then that was followed by inclusivity. Public praise in this regard was really centered around all the brand's initiatives to support social causes. Social responsibility is really becoming important in the fast fashion industry to conduct business ethically and sustainably by moving or really considering the impact on society and their environment as a whole. Fashion brands are moving towards working with suppliers who promote safe working conditions and fair labor practices. And we saw that in 2020 when H&M actually decided to cut ties with the Chinese cotton supplier that was alleged to make use of forced labor. After the COVID-19 outbreak as well, we saw that several brands took initiatives to get involved into their communities and support frontline workers. Burberry in particular was commended by the public after news that they had retooled the Yorkshire trench coat factory actually to produce PPE clothing and supply surgical masks to the frontline workers during the pandemic. And then Primark also donated 74,000 clothing items and towels to patients and NHS workers at the Nightingale Hospital in London. Other social causes that really stood out that got praise was Burberry's partnership yet again with Leeds and the Leeds Playhouse, where they included the development of the Burberry Inspire program and its partnership with the Macmillan Children's Book Centre, which was actually there to open libraries at several schools. So that really received quite good praise from the public. Moving on to the topic of diversity inclusivity, the two other brands, as I mentioned, that really stood out in the positive side of social consideration was ASOS and Ted Baker. These are just two of the examples of the initiatives that drove this positivity and praise from the public. You can see there that ASOS was focused on more of the inclusivity agenda, where they launched a new feature in the app that allowed consumers to view outfits in different body types before they actually purchased the items. Ted Baker, on the other hand, had different campaigns. This one in particular stood out that was really centered around diversity. They partnered with an organization called Key Change to become a sponsor of their talent development program, which was really created to support women and gender minority artists. So again, a really good push and initiative that was well received by the public. Looking a little bit more into the complaints in social considerations, we saw that physical safety of consumers drove the most of the negativity, followed by human rights and diversity, and then employee treatment. Over the years, we saw that the fashion industry in general has really been criticized for lacking diversity inclusivity efforts, with a lot of people feeling excluded or underrepresented. However, in the recent years, there's been a growing movement we saw with the brands to become more inclusive, both from sort of the designer brands and brand side to try and push for change to start happening. What stood out during the analysis period was that Primark and H&M, which got brought under fire when they implemented same-sex fitting rooms in the UK, in an effort to become more inclusive at branches. But this initiative really, like I mentioned, got backlash from consumers who expressed their concerns about young children and women's privacy and safety rights. On the subject, however, of human rights, again, the fashion industry was associated with numerous human rights violations over the 3-year period, linking back to issues that were surrounding forced and alleged child labor to poor working conditions and low wages. Multiple authors actually criticized H&M, Next, and Boohoo, as well as Primark, for the ongoing modern-day slavery, as they called it, at their factories across Asia. Some authors actually referenced gender-based violence in these conversations, where it was alleged that women factory workers were mistreated by factory managers, which came out in the conversation. Because this was quite a topical incident, we also wanted to look at how the unisex change room event or incident started sort of unfolding over this period. And looking at the timeline for the conversation around this issue, consumers really first began to express their concerns all the way back in 2020, as you can see there on the left. The level of concern then started escalating through to 2021, when more of customers started pushing back on the concept of gender-neutral change rooms, before then eventually developed into sort of a full-blown reputational issue in 2022, as you can see to the right there. But this was driven by a particular incident that happened in the change rooms. So again, unfortunately, we can see that the issues wasn't really addressed by the brands in time to try and avoid that uproar and reputational issues that unfolded in 2022. This slide is just looking at how Primark then attempted to respond to these growing concerns by the public. Their response was really to create a second option in the change rooms that was labeled woman only. But in this instance, there was a new type of backlash that started being created surrounding the question of what they meant by woman only. So again, this signals the importance of how brands need to go about communicating important messages, and how this can quickly, if you don't do that, evolve into really dangerous territory when a narrative can quite easily be controlled by internet activists and other consumers. So the discourse on this event really became dangerously close for Primark to being perceived as anti-trans, being a whole that brought a whole new extra level of conflict to the storyline. Then in closing to the section, what we also found here is when we looked at the data and the conversations that came around the change room incidents, was really the safety concerns raised by consumers surrounding the actual change rooms. And that went beyond just gender and actually spoke about physical attributes of the changing rooms. Consumers were speaking about things like the doors not having locks, or curtains being flimsy or too short, when things those are the kind of things that could have easily been fixed. So again, we know that the brand's intentions behind the initiatives were good, but it leaves a question as to the level of understanding there is for their different consumer needs that is broader than just the type of clothing that they want to wear. We're now going to delve into the governance section. This was actually one of the biggest challenges that faced the fashion industry, and it was the lack of accountability and transparency in the supply chains, including disclosing information about the materials used in the production of the clothes and the working conditions of workers and the wages they've been paid. So the governance conversation, as you can see here, was also the second highest ESG factor, accounting for 64.5% of all of this conversation. And when we looked at the breakdown by brand, it mirrored the social considerations quite closely. So you can see there again, Primark holding the largest share, followed by H&M and then Next. But these similarities in the brand rankings are to be expected, considering that there is quite significant overlap between the three ESG segments, but in specifically more related to governance and social issues when looking at the data. Here we can see the similarities that I showed you in the social consideration a little bit more visually when we plotted this over time. And you can see that these spikes were much the same to both environmental and social considerations. The interesting point here, though, is the way that consumers spoke about these events, which was different. For social consideration, as an example, consumers really focused on the actual social issue at hand. But within the governance conversations, they were more focused on the brand's policies surrounding these issues and events. Thank you, Mel. So when we unpack the thematic drivers of governance, again, we can see that ESG policies was the top driver of conversation at 66.7% and was also the most negative topic, getting to about 87.1% negativity. The second largest driver there was company finances as 9.2%, followed by profits above people at 6.5%. What was interesting to note, though, about the topic of company finances is that it's usually quite positively received. We do these types of indices for different industries across different markets, and this particular topic is usually more positive when consumers start praising the brands about their performances. But we saw quite the opposite. It was quite a diverse dividing sort of topic within the UK fashion industry. On the right, we can also see, again, a similar picture to the previous one, looking at the brand breakdown and the sentiment linked to each. And we can see that most of the brands receive quite high negativity, with the exception, yet again, of Burberry, which we'll look at shortly. Unpacking these complaints, we saw the biggest contributor was ESG policies. This was really often linked to complaints where people were accusing the brands of greenwashing. And we'll have a little bit of a section just now looking at the themes that came out when we looked at greenwashing as well. Many of the brands have been accused of having policies that are not really environmentally friendly or socially responsible, and didn't prioritize good governance. These complaints have really included allegations of animal abuse, which Mel mentioned before, as well as the use of unsustainable materials. Another area of concern that was raised in the governance section was the employment practices, which I've spoken to before. Many consumers here criticize brands like ASOS, Next, and JD Sport for their employment practices, especially during the pandemic. There was a few allegations that came through that many workers either lost their jobs or was forced to actually go to work out of fear of losing their jobs. And this started raising questions about these brands' treatments of their employees. Thank you, Mal. Looking at this slide, this is what I mentioned in terms of the greenwashing. Now, you'll see quite a lot of similarities to what Mel has spoken to before when brands receive praise. But here we highlighted some of the key themes where consumers started making references to greenwashing. As you can see there, consumers felt that most of the brand's initiatives were very narrow and very insignificant. They felt that only focusing on the environmental part of it was not enough. And that it needs to be more comprehensive to really cover the full value chain and all aspects of ESG. They also felt that brands tended to pat themselves on the backs when, even for the smallest initiatives, when it came to sustainability efforts, and that was not really well received by them. And secondly, linked to this was also the fact that they felt that the marketing surrounding these efforts were really only there to drive good PR tactics. Another theme that surfaced was that the public felt that there wasn't enough transparency in the claims that the brands were making, and that they said that most of them were unsubstantiated. So they really called the brands out and wanted them to take accountability for false claims. Lastly, the public also felt that the fashion industry as a whole is just not sustainable, and they called for the complete overhaul of the business model. Here we're just looking at some of the example mentions, which we'll keep up for a few seconds, but you can see there some of the key themes that came out across ESG policies, the profits above people, transparency, and the company finances. Thanks, Mal. Great. So as Mel said, can't all be negative. We're now going to look at the positive side of governance. And we can see that the topic of ESG policies was also quite polarizing across these conversations. While it was the biggest source of negativities for some brands, others really received positive mentions around the ESG policies and commitments. The ESG policies, as you can see, they contributed 51.5% of all positive governance mentions, and that was followed by company finances and then partnerships and collaborations. Burberry really stood out with the largest positive to negative governance mention ratio, with 82.1% positivity to only 17.9% negativity. That is a really great performance by Burberry. The positivity was really around the post that Manchester United's Marcus Rashford actually did on his partnership with Burberry. In the post specifically, he stated that Burberry shared his vision of supporting vulnerable communities, and he noted that the brand really showed commitment and provided financial investment to support these efforts. So again, someone with a big following and the type of initiative and how it was communicated really sat well with the public. Here is some of the example mentions again in the positivity side to view. Thanks, Mal. I think we can maybe just move on quickly, just conscious of time. So in this last section, we are going to focus on conversation using our risk segments. As Mel mentioned earlier, we have developed industry-specific risk factors, which range both from operational to reputational risk, that our crowd then uses to help surface critical mentions that need urgent attention by these organizations. We know that social media can be a place of complaint, but it also drives a massive impact and change, both positive and negativity. And that can stretch far beyond social media and have quite a long-lasting effect on brands if it's not addressed. And that's also really why social media has been labeled as the court of public opinion. Being able to identify and recognize these emerging issues and respond to consumer issues quite quickly, and also understanding the dynamics and real-time environment in which these brands sort of can play in, they can anticipate and address these risks a lot better, and to try and avoid a bigger impact when it comes to these complaints. So in this slide that Mel has up, the chart here is showing the volume contribution by risk factor for the industry. What was interesting to note is that there was only one operational risk factor, which was downtime, that came into the top 5. Which was, the rest were all reputational led. Downtime in this case, just for everybody, would be instances where people are referencing websites or apps not working when they're trying to purchase from the brands. And the reason that was really sort of an interesting takeout is, again, the reports that we do in other industry and other markets usually do contain a lot more operational risk than reputational risk. And it was interesting to see the flip of this in the UK fashion industry. That being said, we can see that accusations of unethical behavior was the largest driver of risk-related conversation. Again, this was very much linked to the events we've already discussed, and you can see how there is then also, it's correlating with the other risk factors like discrimination and health concerns. There was also an overlap with protests and boycott, which refers to the references where consumers were urging others to boycott brands completely. And that is what we can see actually in this chart. So here we specifically looked at the risk factor of boycotts of the brands over the 3-year period. And you can see a clear correlation between the spikes in protest actions and the petitions with ESG events that we've already discussed previously and highlighted in this report. And this really just speaks to the potential long-lasting damage these events can have on brands if they don't respond to or execute with very careful thought and consideration these efforts that they are putting out to drive change. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to hand back over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Jamie. Right, we have, first of all, I just want to congratulate Melanie and Jamie for getting through that very extensive amount of content in a very efficient amount of time, and thank you for all the work that went into that. I want to invite questions from who's been listening in on that, and are there, if you'd like to type in your question or actually unmute yourself and raise a question, please feel free and provide a moment for that. Okay, while you're thinking about that, Mel and Jamie, I have a question around the court of public opinion, actually, which I think would be interesting to get your perspective on. From what you've presented, looking at consumer sentiment and the ability, by the use of your tools, being able to look historically at how things compare year on year, I think what's very clear to me certainly is how that consumer sentiment drives consumer behavior. Now, in your experience within fashion and perhaps the other industries that you do work in, can you give an idea of what that translates to in terms of opportunities and risks for brands?
That is a very loaded question, Colin, with many an answer. So firstly, I think that we have literally seen people overthrow decisions made by brands by purely talking about it on social media. We've seen instances in the insurance industry where unfairness about a claim that was made or paid out, even though it was the most fair thing according to the policies and the terms of what the person signed up for, people just come in uproar of it. And we've seen insurance brand having to reverse their decisions because of the reputational impact that something that has like that on the brand. And they have to then shift gear into managing that reputational issue for sure. As a whole, we have seen social media data being a leading indicator of what is to come in things like customer satisfaction scores, NPS, survey feedbacks, etc. And the reason for that, it is an unsolicited data set that really, when the person is standing in line at Primark and they're feeling the pain, they then and there post about it on the social platforms. And they often post about it to make it known to the brands because they feel it'll get a different reaction than a normal feedback point would. So, as I say, we've seen social media sit well next to the normal kind of feedback from consumers because it's the leading indicator. It is the sign of things to come. But also the way we structure it, it gives you a great granular view of the why, which a lot of, I think, feedback forms don't give you. And the other feedback formats kind of is structured according to what you as a brand want to know, where social media kind of brings the things that you didn't even know that people were talking about. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, Colin, but I think the sway that this type of thing has, well, there is sway in the reputational public nature of what people bring to social media.
Yeah. What occurs to me, what you mentioned, Mel, is that you look at what people are talking about. Is it smoke or is it fire? And if you find the fire, then you got to realize, well, what is it going to burn? Is it going to burn a brand's reputation? Is it going to burn sales?
Yeah.
And that's what I think is quite interesting about the findings in the fashion industry in particular.
I also think it's an early warning system often, social media. As Jamie showed in the Primark example, had Primark picked up earlier and sooner on the changes that could have been made, they could have addressed their campaign completely differently. And the awareness of the conversation, I think, is key. And then the investigation of it to understand what your next steps are.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a couple of questions coming through. The first from Patrick. What do you think social media data or consumer sentiment, do you think social media data or consumer sentiment has generally not been reported on in traditional ESG reporting? I'm happy to take that, Mel and Jamie, if that's okay. So speaking from Relative's perspective, where we assist organization with their ESG reporting, the reason why I don't think it's been used is I don't think it's taken seriously. The efficacy of what consumer sentiment translates to in terms of the behavior and the risks that I think have been highlighted have not been fully considered. I think that it may translate to a corporate affairs issue, and that may be dealt with in that particular way. I think what's very interesting of what you've presented is there's this opportunity to actually track what those issues might be historically, to be able to look at your peers and competitors from a campaigns perspective, yes, but also from a governance perspective, the true stakeholder risk that's associated with what's happening with your employees, what's happening with your supply chain. And I think that there could be significant value for that, with that.
Colin, as the data geek, I want to add that just the structuring of social media, as I said in the beginning, is really difficult. As the ESG experts would know, there's about 7 frameworks within E, and there's about 12 in S, and there's about 9 in G, and there's no one framework for the feedback from consumer. So in the most salesy way that I can possibly say it, the other reason it's not used is because there is no framework to map the data against in social media, and that's what we have tried to do here is start a framework for the consumer type feedback and report it so that it can sit right next to the more formal frameworks.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Mel. A question from George. What are they doing different from other brands to get positive in ESG? George, I don't know if you want to elaborate on your question. If you'd like to, you're most welcome to. But are you talking to, should we assume that you're talking about the brands that were analyzed, perhaps?
Yes, I'm talking about the brands because from the graph, most of the time the Burberry are getting more positive yeah, certain age. And maybe they're doing something. Maybe they're doing something different that maybe the other branch is able to follow,
Right,
or
right.
maybe yeah, maybe they have some sort of a model or
Yeah. Okay.
process
Yeah.
to get into that initiative, and maybe the other branch should follow that, or if maybe perhaps maybe we can share
Yes.
what
Yeah.
tactics are they doing, something like that. So I'm not sure. Yeah, because the data, well, that's only from the consumer side. So, but behind that, we don't know yet what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, George. So if I understand George's question correctly, Mel and Jamie, what could brands do to match what Burberry managed to accomplish? You know, Burberry was recognized consistently on a positive basis.
Yeah.
What do you think the primary conditions of that were?
So interestingly, we had a conversation about this with the Ethical Good team in the room when we presented this in person, also with the team, the people that joined that day. Burberry is an interesting one in the sense that the type of consumer, and this is where you need to kind of also start thinking about who is actually posting and not just what is being posted. So if you think about the Primarks of the world, they have a much, I would say, bigger, more, price sensitive, probably more woke, for lack of a better statement, consumer base, where the Burberry might not have this phenomenally active social, consumer base that speaks on social media, and they possibly have the luxury to actually care more about, alligator skins and python skins being used in items. So I think there's just an inherent, who is Burberry, what is their brand, and how focused their campaigns were. I think their whole thing was the quality of their partnership and the focus of what they put out there. And it was quite unique and specific. If you think about them doing python skins and fashion design students versus the Primarks of the world that went the bigger route of vegan lines and change rooms, etc. So I think I'm definitely not a marketing expert by any means, but and Jamie, you can probably correct me if I'm wrong on your thoughts, and Colin the same. I think it's just the focus of it all. They were very good around their narrative of what they put out there. They were good on their choice of who they partnered with. And I think their response to people responding to them was also well managed. So if I had to focus on the positives, I would say that was definitely a contributing factor. I don't know if you want to add to that, Colin.
Yeah, just a comment. But before I do, I just want to find out if Jamie wanted to contribute anything to that.
No, nothing in addition, but that's definitely sort of my take as well. Is they were for sure very focused. Don't want to use the word calculated, but very focused in the way that they executed and what types of messages they put out there and at what time, right? So if you look at it, there was sort of certain events that happened and they were quite good at sort of matching specific things at that, but it was very well executed, which I think is again, I think brings me back to the point that I made is if you look at the sort of Primark's reactive way that they responded to something that didn't work, instead of carefully considering even just the basics, it could have probably gone a lot better for them. And I think that's kind of where Burberry stood out.
Yeah, the comment I wanted to make is related to what both of you shared, and that is, it seems both on the positive as well as the negative that the degree of transparency and accountability that brands are taking in terms of what they're doing and why they're doing it are rewarded. I think it's fair to say that brands are not going to get everything right every day, but it's the way, as you said, Jamie, how they respond to that matters. And coming back to I think a related question around transparency and accountability, we've got a question from Peter, where his question is, where's the outrage over the use of hazardous chemicals or treatments on our clothes, such as PFAS, hormone disruptors? Where's the concern over microfiber shedding from our clothes? It's surprising to see a lack of conversations about these. Is the industry being successful in steering focus just on materials? Is the question. So I have some thoughts on that, but I'm wondering if Mel or Jamie have something to say on that.
Yeah, that's just one of those things. I mean, we had that category of materials used. That conversation would probably live, and again, the data geek answer here is that conversation would most probably live in that materials used theme. It's not to say that the conversation isn't there. It is just overshadowed by things like organic, vegan, materials, rather than the minutiae of, hormone disruptors, etc. So definitely something that we can actually delve into for you, Peter, is finding that conversation, just seeing the prominence of it and which brands stand out. It's just listing all the contributors is just a very long conversation on a 45-minute webinar, but it's something we can definitely look into.
Yeah. Peter, what I wanted to say to that, I think that first of all, it's really it's quite encouraging, and I think that this was mentioned in the executive summary of the report, of how consumers actually are talking about these things and raising these topics. And I think that there's an opportunity for consumers to inform each other in the process. But I think there's an opportunity for brands to be foot forward on a number of these matters, that if they are addressing hazardous chemicals and treatments, that's a great message to take to their consumers, because if first of all it will inform them of how others are perhaps not doing that, but certainly it becomes a way of being able to enhance reputation. And I think that's what's quite interesting here, is that it's not just about what damages reputations. There definitely are indicators of how that can be enhanced by being more accountable and transparent. A comment from Sophia. Hi, Sophia. This is really insightful. It's empowering to see the value in the consumer public voice through social media. And I would hope that this encourage us as consumers to hold brands to account and push brands in the right direction. That's a great way to finish off our webinar, I think. Jamie and Mel, do you have anything to add to that?
Just the thought of court of public opinion. I think Sophia nailed it on the head there. The pushing brands in the right direction. And yes, awareness from the brand's perspective that it's not just a marketing campaign that has ROI in terms of, how many views and likes it gets, or, or engagement. It's just the nature of the campaigns going out there and really caring about the consumer's perception and reception of it, I would say.
Excellent. Thanks, Mel. I see that some people have already signed off. We realize it's coming up to the hour. Are there any final questions from anybody? Excellent. So just in wrap up, I want to once again thank Data EQ, and particularly Jamie and Mel for their time and their insights and sharing those with us today. In partnership with Ethical Good, we look forward to sharing not only the video of what we've discussed with you today, but the full report as well via email. We encourage you to share it as widely as you wish. And if you'd like any further information with regards to what we've spoken about, or get in touch with us, the contact details are on the screen. If you do have any other questions, please feel free. We're going to be on the line for the next 5 minutes, but also feel free to head off to the rest of your day. Thanks. Okay. Just for those that are still on the line, some interesting comments coming in from Prince Ventura. According to the Fashion Transparency Index, Burberry and primary score is between 31 to 40%, which they're typically disclosing their first-tier manufacturers, as well as detailed information about their policies, procedures, social and environmental goals, governance, supplier assessment, and remediation processes. While H&M got a much higher percentage in terms of that transparency. That is interesting, yeah. And then a series of thanks from the rest of the audience. So yes, the question is that we are happy to share the information. The full report will be available, as well as the video, and we'll be in touch with you via email. Thanks a lot, everyone, and have a great afternoon.